Hey everybody, I'm out here in Los Angeles for the NAMM show for the weekend. I just did an interview with my dear friend Tim Pierce. This is one of the best ones that Tim and I have ever done together. You should definitely check it out. And I want to remind you, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I'm 25,000 away from 3 million. Hit that subscribe button. I know a lot of you think you're subscribed, but you're actually not, so do it now. Here's my interview with Tim. I'm here with Tim Pierce in his castle, his recording studio, the recording capital of
Tarzana, California.
Tarzana, California.
Yeah. Tarzana, Bakersfield, Nashville, Paris, London. We all know this.
So, Tim, we're both holding guitars here, but we're holding guitars because as props right now. But Tim will play here in a little bit.
Yes, I will.
But we don't know what we're going to talk about today. This is like, we're kind of like our Seinfeld, right? It's like, this is about, we make videos about nothing, essentially, but I always am cracking up because Tim always cracks me up, and I just love to ask Tim questions about everything. One of my favorite questions to ask Tim is when he would do sessions, which he doesn't do that many sessions anymore. I'd always call him and say, did you make any mistakes? Knowing that the answer was always no. Tim doesn't make mistakes.
No, you need to be invincible if you're a studio player. Although guitar players, they wanted to hire guitar players to be adventurous too, so you could push it a little bit and make a mistake now and then. But generally, the thing that you do is you do everything perfect the first time.
Okay, so historically, session players, though, to be a session player, how many mistakes could you get away with at a session?
Well, the idea when you show up and they're paying you to do this, and everybody's laughing and having a good time, and everything seems so easy and fun
until you hit record.
But the first take, there's exactly the expectation on the first take that it's going to sound amazing.
Right.
And drums and bass are pretty much first take instruments. Guitar's a little tougher because you have different sounds you might be reaching for or whatever. Yeah. But when you throw down something on the first take, it has to inspire confidence. Oh, we're going to get this.
Do you freak out a little bit though when you're doing at first? I know
I did.
Tim's can be a little neurotic. I mean, that's. I think that goes with being a perfectionist, though. You only get to be as good as you are by being a perfectionist. Now, people accuse me of being a perfectionist. I am far from being a perfectionist. But Tim does not like to make mistakes. And if you go back historically, I'm always one to go back to the 70s, and I've always been fascinated with session guitar. This is why I've been following Tim since long before I knew him. I followed his career from YouTube, basically. One of the reasons that I got on YouTube was because I saw Tim on YouTube, and I said, okay, well, there are pro guitar players like Tim. But going back to the 70s, and the guys that came up in the generation before you, the Larry Carltons, the people like that, Jay Gradens, these people, when they would come in, they would play these things flawlessly. For the most part, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a code in the studio that you had to be ready. You had to be bulletproof, and you had to be ready for it. And some people weren't ready. In fact, Larry Carlton used that phrase, he's not ready yet, when somebody would show up and not quite be able to throw down. And I was lucky because when I got here in 1980, all of that had kind of peaked, and you could be more quirky. You could be rough around the edges. You could be more of a rock player.
Is it because people would spend more time making records? Was that part of it?
The style had changed a little bit. It became more rock-oriented than kind of the previous period, which was a little more muso-oriented, I would have to say. Yeah. And then in the 90s, it really got sweet for me because when Nirvana showed up, then the guy who could sound like he was in the band was who they wanted, and that's who I was. I was the guy who could sound like I was in the band, and I was a band player, but I had the chops to get it done quick and to adapt. And
you had the chops to play the parts with no mistakes.
That's just part of it.
That they weren't out of tune, and the guitars, there's countless records where the guitar players think that they played on the record, Tim, right?
Well, it's true, and a lot of the times the drummer would often get fired in the early days. You remember this because the drums had to be just right
until Beat Detective. Beat Detective is the thing I always complain about that started around 2000. Yeah. Where in Pro Tools you could fix drummers' performances, so you didn't have to fire the drummer because typically the session would go, the drummer would come in, and this is before I was even a producer. Drummer would come into the session. They couldn't cut it. They do 1 day of recording. The producer would bring in a session drummer, and the drummer would quit.
That's right.
And then the band would have to find a new drummer after the record was made, right? This is very common.
Yeah, you could do better than that. I had a drummer friend who would make friends with the band drummer, and so he could sit there and watch the thing happen. And even Kenny Aronoff's story originally about how he got back into Mellencamp's band was that he got fired, and he came back and watched whoever they hired do it. So that's kind of the way to solve it, is to make everybody part of the family, even though it's very hard for the drummer. But if the drummer in the band quits and gets mad, there's nothing you can do.
Okay, let's talk about not making mistakes, though, Tim. So the focus, and we've never really talked about this, about not buzzing notes. It's not just coming up with the right parts. It's everything ringing together. If you have an open string, if you're playing on the B string, and you have an open E string under it, there's no spot where there's a muted note by accident or anything. You have to be... How do you develop the focus to do that?
I think it's by constant repetition. And I was lucky that when I got here, I started doing demo after demo after demo, and then record after record. When I wasn't doing records, I would go back and do demos, and I honed my skills. And in the late 80s, I did publishing demos like excessively, like sometimes 3 songs a day, and I got better at coming up with parts and sounds instantly and immediately. But the idea is it has to sound like a record. There's a big distance in sounding like you're doing something cool and having it sound like it's a record. And
right.
That's where all that comes
with
in.
The precision of
the pocket.
That's right. The pocket, everything
in
about
tune.
it. In tune.
In time.
In time.
And then parts that are hooks.
Right.
That serve the song and that are interesting but stay out of the way of the vocal. All this stuff is extrapolating in your mind, and you're coming up with stuff that's sensitive to everybody, but then you want to be able to be powerful too. I mean, you have to be strong, you have to be sensitive, it has to fit, the sounds have to change.
Right.
The touch has to be right, the pocket has to be right, it has to be perfectly in tune. Wow.
When I interviewed Steve Lukather, he said people expected you to come in and just create the arrangements for them.
That's totally true. That's at a certain point, there was an era where people would bring in charts and the studio players would play the charts that were written by brilliant arrangers, and then they would deviate. But they actually were playing little percolating parts. There'd be 3 guitar players all reading 3 different parts. You hear that on Motown stuff a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
But then it changed, and the studio musician became the arranger.
That was the Tommy Tedesco era, right? That
Absolutely.
First era.
Motown, too. I mean, the 60s and for a great part of the 70s, too.
Right.
And you would play the part, and maybe you would make it better, but you would actually play the written part. And the arrangers were brilliant, and they would create these really cool things. But there was a point, and it was the 80s, when the band arranged everything right then and there.
Yeah.
And that's the Nashville tradition too.
Has that always been the Nashville tradition?
Absolutely, yeah. Because they're reading number charts, so they're actually, one guy would say,
improvising parts.
I even heard this in Nashville. You take the heat in the second verse. Take the heat in the second verse.
What does that mean?
It means you're the guy who steps out in the second verse.
Take the heat. Now I've never heard this term ever until right now. Take the heat.
Haven't thought of it till right now.
So the need to be an arranger, the producer basically is relying on the session guys to come up with the parts. Let's be real about this.
It's absolutely true. I mean, everybody works together. I did a Rob Thomas record with Matt Serletic, and that's the first time I met Tom Bukovac. And I remember I would work with Matt Serletic and think, why is Matt so earnest all the time? He's just so earnest all the time. And then Bukovac shows up on the session. I'm working with Tom, which is another amazing thing. And Serletic is just laughing the whole time. I've never seen this. And I realize it's because Bukovac is like coming up with all the beautiful, the core of the arrangement, and not to take away from Matt, because everybody participates.
Right.
But it's shared.
Well, Tom is a Nashville guitar player, and he's used to doing that. This is what you do in Nashville.
Bukovac, yes.
Bukovac,
but he's particularly brilliant at it. But what I realized, it's not that Matt's being earnest, it's that I'm too serious and I'm working too hard.
Right.
And they're just playing. And but it's exactly what you're talking about. Tom's a great arranger. On the session, he's a great arranger. And so, I mean, it was a perfect example of the band doing the arranging. But that doesn't take away from producers, because...
No.
as a producer, you need to step away.
The producer's making decisions on performances.
Exactly, and then come back in, and you can let the band play, and then later, I mean, like Dan Huff would do that. He would let the band play, and then later he would start honing other guitar parts.
Because he's an excellent guitar player.
But you let the band do their thing. You let everybody rise in the way they want to rise and be naturally, creative.
Let's get back to the precision part of playing, of what you do. Talk about fretting notes. Let's talk about some things that we really never talk about. Where do you put your fingers to make sure that you get the clearest sound?
Okay, it has to be right behind the fret, and you can't press too hard. I mean, the best touch is the lightest touch. The touch that does just enough pressure to get the job done and nothing more. And in fact, great guitar players almost look like they're not doing anything.
Right.
Like I kind of hit a little too hard and I move my hands a little too much, but really great guitar players, their hands barely lift off the neck. And the over rings are really important. Like keyboard players, it's so easy to get things to ring because you're using a sustain pedal.
Right.
Same thing on guitar. A capo is a really great thing in a session for helping with that because these open chords are still the best choices.
That's right.
No matter what key you're in.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a session and the song is in D flat, you tune down a half step and you get the cowboy chords.
That's right.
Or if it's in B flat, maybe you put a capo here, maybe you put a capo here.
Yeah.
You get all the open chords. Nobody sees that capo.
Right.
But that's one thing. But you were talking about fretting. It's really the lightest touch.
And just behind the fret. I always tell people this stuff when I would teach people, play just behind the fret, use just enough pressure to press the string down. You don't want to be gripping it too hard because you'll throw the guitar out of tune.
Okay, now here's the other thing that I just saw you do that people don't talk about. You're playing an A note right there, right?
Yeah.
Is that an A? Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Your third finger, not only is it hitting that A note, but the edge of it is muting the string next to it.
That's right. I always do that. I'm always muting every string that I'm not playing, I am muting.
Exactly. This is the biggest thing, and I talk about it over and over and over. And if you're a studio player, this stuff is instinctive.
Yes.
Every piece of flesh on this hand is muting all the strings except the one you're using.
Yeah.
And really, the tip of this is always touching the next string. And look at me, the second one is too.
Just to make sure.
Exactly.
Just to make sure.
But you did it right there.
And I do things where I will play and I will even mute with the palm of my right hand just to make sure.
Absolutely.
That
always.
that the notes are not ringing. It's triple, quadruple muting that happens. You only want to have that one note
playing, or two, whatever you're choosing.
Or three or four. Only the ones that are meant to be played are the ones that are not being muted.
Yep.
And then you have to keep your fingers round enough to where any string that you want to have rings. So there are so many. You have to be really focused on the precision and have a level of concentration. And this is what you're incredibly good at, Tim, is your focus.
Well, I learned on the job, and you really, there are people who could focus better than me for sure. But you come to a city like this, and I've always said the competition is not local, it's not regional, it's not national, it's international. So the best keyboard player from Paris moves here, and the best guitar player from Russia moves here, whatever, Wow, the best, Ilya in Nashville. I don't know. I think he's
Ilya
from
Toshinsky. Yeah,
he's from Russia. And he's phenomenal, and he moved to Nashville, right?
Yeah.
And so everybody, the best musicians, move to these cities. Now I would say it's Nashville. It's not LA anymore.
Yeah,
it's Nashville. The best people in the world move to a particular city, so you end up rising to that level. I never rose to the level of some of these guys that I idolize, but I got part of the way there. And so that's the great thing about it. When you're in an environment, I got to sit next to Steve Lukather, Dan Huff, Michael Thompson, Tom Bukovac. I got to sit next to all these great players. And so when you're sitting next to them and you go, oh, I can't kid myself. I see it right there. They've got this incredible, my skills might be this
Tim,
much.
You're very humble.
Well,
you're very humble.
But you see that.
You have incredible skills. The interesting thing is on your channel you play a lot of lead guitar, but you really didn't do a lot of lead guitar playing on records because there wasn't, in the era that you grew up, that there became less and less and less, and eventually no.
Well, but even when I first moved here, I didn't know how to play rhythm guitar because all I cared about was soloing. When I started at 12, I moved here at age 20. And it was like, oh, I forgot. Rhythm guitar?
What are those chords?
I learned on the job, basically. And I got better every year. I got a little better at it. And especially it's funny with R&B guitar, I spent the entire decade of the 90s trying to get that really smooth R&B thing.
Yeah.
And by the time I had it, it kind of went out of fashion.
Tim, let's talk about...
But I can still do it.
Let's talk about practicing with because we don't talk about this that much. Playing with a drum machine or playing with a real drummer, and the difference in your pocket when you're actually playing with a drummer. If you're playing with Vinny Colaiuta versus playing with a program drum part, what is the difference, and why do you need to be able to do both?
Well, the thing about drummers is you may not realize is that they all have radically different feels and styles, and like Matt Chamberlain has his whole different thing. Aaron Sterling has his whole different thing. Vinny has his whole different thing. It's incredibly different the way they do everything. And that astounds me because you would think drums, they can sound similar maybe when you hear them on records. It's not that way at all.
Right.
These guys have a signature that's totally personal. And what happened was, when I came up, I moved here in 1980, the emphasis was always lay back, play behind the beat. So everybody learned to pull back. You know, like Bryan Adams' drummer, everybody's drummer that was great was way behind, right?
Right.
Way behind. And then, when the computer showed up, then it all shifted to right on the grid.
Right.
And so then you have someone like Josh Freese, who is absolutely on the grid. Mm-hmm. Well, everybody learned to play on the grid. I got fired from one session because the producer said, you know, we're not going to get this. You're just not playing. You're playing too far back. And I went, what? I've spent my whole life trying to have a good feel, and everybody told me it was behind the beat. And so everything shifted. So I gradually learned to bring it forward and play on the grid. And so that changed. But now you really want to be able to do both.
Right. And what are the things that you're keying in on when you come in with a drummer? A Matt Chamberlain versus Vinny Colaiuta versus Greg Bissonette versus whoever. They all have their different feels where they play the snare, where they play the kick drum. What are you locking into?
The way I put it is this. First of all, you don't want to be too loud.
Yep.
You want to basically be inside the drum kit. You want to be between the hi-hat and the snare. You want to be between the bass drum and the kick drum and the snare. You want to be interlocked in the middle. You want to be in the middle of the kit with your rhythm part.
Yeah.
And if you're that, and you really can't be too, you got to get just the right level for that so that you become like a piece of percussion in the drum kit. That's how I look at it.
Right.
And if you do that, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. So you and I talk about gear a lot. I don't even do sessions anymore, and I rarely do videos on recording, but it's really my favorite thing. I love to record. I mean, I really do. It's one of my passions. That's why I do my What Makes This Song Great series. It's not just the analyzing the songs, it's the actual production, because that's really a production series, disguised as music appreciation and music theory maybe, but it's really a music production concept that I have. You and I talk about finding different types of speakers, for example, and we're always on the quest for this stuff, even if we're not playing sessions, because of why, though? Why do we like this so much, Tim?
It takes a lifetime to get good at something. I heard this quote the other day. They were asking Pablo Casals why he still practiced 4 hours a day in his 90s. He said, I'm noticing some improvements. That's how I feel.
Right.
It's like, it took me a long time to get here, and now I'm still learning, and I'm learning some stuff better than I ever have.
But you're learning stuff about sound.
Totally.
Right,
and I was too busy.
Yeah.
And I was collecting all kinds of stuff that was right for the time, the ultimate AC30, the ultimate Fender Jaguar, the ultimate rack, whatever. We were all chasing the stuff we had to chase in the moment. But now it's kind of up to me. And so I've been obsessed with vintage Celestion speakers. And over the last 2 years, I've bought
Tim
quads.
and I talk about this stuff all the time.
All the time.
I'm obsessed with vintage Celestion speakers as well.
Yeah, and you confirmed something to me. I was going, what about these 65 watt? And you said, you got to get them, what is it, the 65-watt Celestion that was just made from 78 to 80?
Yeah, like 79, 80, yeah.
Yeah,
they were
the producer's favorite.
Early GSM 800 cabinets.
And I heard about them, somebody mentioned them, and I said, Rick, what do you think about these? You got to get them, you got to get them, you got to. So I went out and got some, and lo and behold, they're like a high-fidelity version of the old Celestions that I've been using. So they serve a great purpose some of the time. And somehow the old Celestions, they sound so warm and so musical. Now I have another thing that I discovered. A friend of mine, he sold me some reconed old Celestions, reconed with the really good kits that, in the right way.
Yep.
Oh my, they sound amazing, tighter. So,
they actually become loose, the sound.
Yeah, and that's good for some things. I mean, Phil X talks about this, about how a vintage amp, you have to actually play different because it doesn't respond as quickly to a modern high-gain amp. And I'm going, that's so true. You actually adapt your playing to every instrument. Like, this instrument, I'm going to play it differently than when I play the instrument. Every instrument changes the way you play. Consequently, every piece of gear you use to make every sound changes the part you come up with. It literally changes the music that you make.
I'm always asking Tim, Tim will make a video. You don't do a lot of gear videos, but every time he does a gear video, I buy something that he uses. I just do. There's a pedal, like, what is this pedal? Or I'll call Tim, and Tim's like, oh, I've got 14 of those. Like the Nobles pedals. Tim, why do you have however many of those that you have?
Well, part of it is it's a little bit of an obsession when you find the right pedal. Like the ODR ones that I have. Now, this is a great story because, once again, Tom Bukovac is very generous, and he brought John Shanks, I think, an ODR1 Nobles. Mm-hmm. He apparently bought a box of these.
This is an overdrive pedal.
It's an overdrive. He gave them to all his friends a number of years ago. He bought a NOS box of these. Now, think about a guitar player being so secure about what he does. He goes, I found the greatest thing that works great for me. I'm going to share it with everybody else. I mean, that's pretty generous. Cool. So he gave Shanks one, and Shanks gave me one. I ended up using it for the rest of my life. Basically, the early 90s.
But Tim, how many do you own of them?
I think at this point I own a few.
I bought one from Tim.
Yeah, he asked me about the pedal. I said, I'll give you the one I was using in the video. You know, it's like, it was fun to do. If something is rare and valuable, you feel like you would like to have a few of them for a while, and then you...
Just in case something happens.
And part of this is I've given a couple of those ODR ones away. The reason I have so many is I found someone in the UK who had bought 30 new old stock ODR ones in Spain, and he contacted me, and I said, okay, I'll take this many of them. And, you know, they do go up in value. So I remember 3 years ago, I finally found out about the Mostortion very late.
Yep.
And I bought, I think, the last remaining 5 in the world that weren't completely torn up.
Tim's buying them so that other people can't get them. I'm just kidding.
But now they've been cloned. I'm all for everything being available to everybody. So now the Mostortion has been cloned by our friend Greg Droman with the Karma pedal, and also by the people at Dan Electro.
I got the Karma pedal.
Well, this is exactly what you talked about. You saw it in my video.
I did.
You contacted Greg. You bought the Karma from him.
That's right.
I am all for, I don't want any of this exclusivity. I want everybody to have everything. There are certain components that don't exist anymore, and they try and clone them, and you can't quite do it. And it's nobody's fault. But there is a pedal, the Shanks Vermeran ODS one is probably the closest thing I've heard so far that captures the sound of an early 90s ODR one.
Why, Tim, why do I buy these? Why do I even, when I'm not even doing sessions anymore, why do I still want these things? Is it that it just never kind of leaves your head that you're always a producer?
I think we're falling more in love with the things we loved originally. I've noticed one thing about myself at this point in time. I was too busy to take the time to appreciate this stuff, and now I have more time to do my own thing with these pedals. And I think you're falling in love with guitars even more than you used to.
Not just guitars, drums. When I interviewed Bernard Purdy last week, and I asked him about how he would mute his toms, deaden his drums. You know, what kind of tape he would use. He used gaff tape, he used paper towels, things like that. And I've done a million drum sessions, and I always tune the drums. I always got the sounds, and I just love that. And I'm not really a drummer, but I'm obsessed with drum sounds. I just bought a new snare 2 weeks ago for the sessions that I'm not going to do. But I bought a new Keplinger snare, and it sounds phenomenal.
But consider this, I keep telling people that I get to be an artist on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And whether they believe me or not, that's their business. But I get to be an artist on YouTube, so the stuff that I use reaches more people now than it did in some ways when I was using it on big records, because I was anonymous. Now it's me. Now if I use a piece of gear and I write my own songs on YouTube, if I use a piece of gear on YouTube, I'm reaching people with the sound I'm making as an artist in a greater measure than I ever did before. And I would argue that point with you. When you sit a Park amp behind you and you get that sound and you're doing some song with some pedal, you're reaching more people. So why is it less of an experience for you now? True. Why is it less valuable? It's more valuable because it's you, it's your channel and your audience, and it's a direct connection. So I would say that's it. And also, I think you fall more in love when you're older. You just appreciate stuff even more.
Right.
I mean, I'm falling in love with all of these instruments even more than I ever have. And now I have time. I'm not busy running off to a session trying to get something that sounds like the latest Kelly Clarkson record or the latest, whatever record, depending on what era. I can actually make the sounds I want for me and my audience.
One of the smartest things I ever did in a session was it was in 2000 when I was first starting to engineer my own sessions. Because in the first couple of years as a producer, I had an engineer that I worked with. So I remember I was doing my first drum session, and my buddy Billy, who had been doing my recording for me, Billy Hume, said, "Listen, you go get the drum. You know what you're doing. Get the drum sounds up. I'll come by the studio and I'll check to make sure everything is good." He comes by the studio. He says, "Perfect. Everything's in phase. Everything is great and everything." So I start the session, and I'm thinking, I'm getting the drummer. And I was like, the snare doesn't sound good. This guy's snare just doesn't really sound good. So I say to my assistant, Ken, GL, that you guys have seen in my videos before, I was like, "I'm going to go to Guitar Center. I'm going to buy a snare." He's like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm not going to have this thing ruined by this crappy snare sound. Snare sound is everything." This is really before sample replacement was, you had sample replacement, but wasn't easy to do then. It wasn't as easy. So I go down and I pick out a great snare, and I paid whatever, $400 for it or so, and I come back to the studio, and we put up a snare, and instantly, great sounding recording. The having a great snare and investing the money in that made me realize that as a producer, I'm in charge of how the record sounds. The better the record sounds, the more work I get, and the better records I get. And then I started collecting things, not just snare drums, entire drum sets, cymbals, guitar amps, guitars, bass amps, basses. I used every combination of drum heads I could to experiment, and I learned all these different things: how to tune drums, what type of combinations of guitar amps work together, what combinations of guitars work together. To me, this is one of the most fun things I ever did, is actually learning about all these instruments. So when I interview Bernard Purdie and I ask him about these things, or I interviewed Ron Carter and I asked him, "How did you mic the basses?" I'm asking him as a producer then, and as a historian, how did you do things back in those days? Now, there is knowledge that you have, Tim, of doing sessions from the time you began as a session player that is probably lost at this point, unless you don't really talk about things that you were doing in sessions, let's say back in 1983. What was your setup? What was the Tim Pierce setup at the time?
This is so great because, like you're saying, producers you have to have this global view of everything because you're responsible for everything, and that includes the drums. I have producer friends who built outrageous guitar arsenals, and then they would hire somebody like Ross, the drum doctor, to come in with all the snares and stuff, and then the drummer wouldn't have to. If it was the band drummer, you'd have a specialist with the collection of drums who would come in. There were several of these guys. guys, Jeff Jonas.
They bring in their drums, they tune the drums, change the heads, do all that.
And that guy would be sitting there the whole time, so you'd never have to worry.
Yeah.
Then if it was somebody like Vinny or Kenny Aronoff, they would bring their collection of drums. So somebody had a drum collection. You're in Atlanta, you had your own. Yep. You're like Brendan O'Brien, you buy everything because you want everything. But Rob Cavallo had bass amps. He has an amazing Hammond organ. Everybody who produces records wants to have all the stuff at the ready. So
that's why I have so much gear in my studio.
Exactly. But you ask about the 80s.
Yeah.
And it was amazing because there wasn't that much available, right? And there was nobody making... there were only stock amps. So, like Jay Graydon.
Well, talk about what were the stock amps?
Well, there were only two things you really like. The first time I worked with Lukather was in the early '80s. It was at Sunset Sound with Al Schmidt. On this record, a friend of mine, David Garfield, had this band called Charisma, and he hired all these great musicians to come in and play on his kind of Muso record, right?
Right.
And so I got to be in the studio with Steve Lukather when I was 24 years old. It was awesome. And at that time, it was the time of him playing on Dirty Laundry and all these other things. He would show up with a pair of Marshalls and a pair of Fender Deluxes. That's all there was.
Right.
And in my case, when I went to New York to do John Waite and Bon Jovi, or even here, what you did is you brought your Marshalls, the producer had their Marshalls, the engineer had their Marshalls, you got the Marshalls from your friends, and you would look at 8 Marshalls and find the Marshall that worked right for the part, and you use that one.
Right.
And then maybe you try another one for a different part. And then there were these guys who would make them into high gain, there was like Jose and Mike Morin. And,
that's right.
And those didn't always sound that good, but you kept trying that stuff. And then Paul Rivera modded the Fenders to make to give you a lead tone. You'd have to push the Fender with a Rivera mod, right?
That's
because they didn't distort that much either.
That's right.
So to simplify your question, there were Fender Deluxes and Marshall 100 watts, basically. That was what you used, and you got all the sounds out of that palette. That's why Lukather, that's what he had. And then he started to build his rack, and he would use the rack in front of those things, He would just buy all the rack stuff initially, and he would use it in front. So the Deluxes were for clean stuff, like I keep forgetting my Michael McDonald, I would assume, and the DDL, you can kind of hear it, right?
Yeah.
And then the Marshalls were for the rock stuff and just switching.
I have owned probably just JCM 800s, for example. I've probably owned
that's what we used
30 of them, maybe.
I used to get them new out of the box, one after the other. They sounded amazing in the 80s.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I own
the
3.
Early 80s.
I think I own 3 right now. Still, I own a couple Plexis. I own JMPs, at least 2 or 3 JMPs, and they're all different. They're
totally different animals. Are you kidding? They're all completely different amplifiers.
Totally different, yes.
I've gone back to Plexis because my first Marshall changed my life when I was 19.
Yep.
And so that's where I'm back to with my Marshalls. Now, I have other boutique amps and stuff, and we both love the Parks.
Yes.
I have amps that simulate other amps. But the Marshalls I love now are the Plexis. Just because I can hear that 60s, 70s edge of breakup thing.
Okay, so Tim, we've been talking and holding guitars. Let's actually have you plug in some sounds for a minute, and let's just hear some of these things that we've been talking about.
Sounds great.
Okay, Tim, what are you playing through here?
This is a very special thing. It's a 1967 PA head, and I got this from Paul Reed Smith. Apparently, he had traded it back and forth with Eric Johnson for a while.
Nice.
And it sounds so amazing. Channel 2, it's got 4 channels. Channel 2 sounds amazing. And it's kind of like edible the way it sounds. I mean, all you have to do is play with the volumes on the guitar and hear. You get every tone. What a beautiful clean tone, right? I mean, you can still hear every note. Turn the guitar down. I'm just in love with it. Now, the speakers I'm using right now, I have several 412s down there.
Okay.
And this particular 412, I'm using one vintage Celestion.
Okay.
Right? Okay, let me find the one. It's right here.
Yep, you've got these Neve, BAE, Neve style.
Yeah, Neve clones, which I love.
Yep,
and the reason I like them is because the output, this is how I control the volume into Pro Tools. So these output knobs are not stepped. They're, it's a smooth glide. So I use these for the actual input level. And I'm blending 2 microphones. So you'll be interested in this. This is a 1971 greenback, pre-roller greenback, okay? And it's blended with that speaker we were talking about, which is the 65 watt from 1978. And that's going through a C800 Sony, which is the modern version of the C37. It's not the C800 with the heatsink. This is a mic that is very hard to find. It wasn't popular. It's just a black microphone that sounds pretty hi-fi. So in lieu of using a Royer, which everybody uses, I'm using this Sony. It's on the high fidelity speaker, getting a more hi-fi sound, a more kind of, 360 sound, and then the 57 is giving me the mid-range fist. Let's hear the 2 mics individually. Here is the 57.
It's giving all the bite and the upper mids.
The C800 through the 65 watt. Good level. I mean, that by itself pleases me. But you can see when I blend in the 57, it becomes even better. Because you get a little of that mid-range fist. So let me get them both in. More is more. There we go. Well, now I'm peaking Pro Tools. Why is louder always better? It just sounds
because
better.
It is.
Yeah, so, okay, so... Let me turn them down a little bit because I've kind of gone a little too far. I use the stock Pro Tools noise gate on everything. Yeah, here, let me put up the gate really quick. And lately I've been liking Echo Boy Jr. Because it just gives a little bit of a shadow. And the trick for me with delays is I roll all the top end off and I have a little modulation. So you barely notice it's there. It just makes the guitar have dimension and float a little. Okay, now at least I'm not peaking red, so that's good. I mean, you just bleed in as much distortion as you want. I mean, I go back to, the 60s with this thing. It just makes me so happy. Anyway, I've gone past the noise gate on this. And there are other amps that are quieter. That's one thing about a Plexi Marshall. The noise floor is loud.
Let's talk about the Plexi that's right below this, Tim. What is that?
A 1968 Super Tremolo. A friend of mine owned this amp for 50 years. And he wanted me to buy it. This is a guy I used to play rock with and party with in the early 80s. A really dear old friend of mine. He moved up to Redding, California. For a long time, he actually managed Waylon Jennings' studio. Really nice musician. Anyway, he kept it for 50 years. I bought it from him last year.
It's in great condition.
Yeah, it's so cool. And I got the cabinets with it, too. So it's a really wonderful thing and a meaningful thing. I mean,
okay, Tim. So since we were talking about your amps, what are the other amps that are behind you? You don't talk about these things that often.
Okay, this is my AC30 substitute.
Your
I've had AC30s.
Or is that which one is that?
It's a Matchless Clubman. My favorite Matchless. It runs hotter than the others.
Yep.
And it's really simple. To me, it sounds like the ultimate AC30. This is a real one from the early days of Matchless, Mark Sampson days. Early days. They sound good today, too. I know the Phil who runs Matchless, the new ones are faithfully good to this, too. But this is an AC30. This is from an engineer friend of mine. This is a one-off from my friend Howard Willing. It's just a custom amp that I kind of fell in love with. Very, very high gain. The high watt, super big, super clean. Great for pedals. They're known as the ultimate pedal platform.
Yep.
Now, this is an AC30, production model AC30 that sounds amazing.
It's a new one.
It's a new one. I recommend the stock AC30 head that you can buy anywhere if you want an AC30 head. It sounds great.
Now, that's just the head, though, right?
That's just the head. Because I always liked separating the head so that I could get to the knobs quickly.
Yep.
Okay, now here is the amp I use most of the time. It's a Divided by 13 RSA 23.
Okay.
Designed by Rusty Anderson, who plays with Paul McCartney. Rusty's an amazing guitar player. Very versatile session guitar player. A lot of people don't know that.
Okay.
He spent years designing this with Fred Tacone, and it's my favorite amp. RSA 23. It's like a cross between a Fender and a Vox and a Marshall. I mean, if I go do a session, I have one of these downstairs in the garage that goes in the trunk of my car, and that's what I take. I can get all my sounds with this this RSA.
Okay, so what else do we have over here too, Tim?
We have the Park 45-100.
Yep.
And then the Bassman sounds
Bassman that I cannot find, which
Yeah.
I've been looking for.
Someday you'll find.
Is it a 64 Bassman?
Yeah, the tuxedo
like that.
version.
Tuxedo.
It's just aesthetics. It was when they had some white knobs. They were making black amps and they had white knobs. So it's just an aesthetic thing I always wanted. Any 64 will sound that good, but and then the Park, which we love.
We love the Park.
Parks. The 18 watt is great. Your blue 18 watt. Incredible.
I love it. It's amazing.
Yeah. So, and then there's all the pedals. Some of them are not hooked up right now because I'm actually redoing my studio. But the pedals come and go. Different times, different purposes. One thing that I want you to see right here that I did get from Tom Bukovac's recommendation is the Ebo reverb, and this thing, it sounds edible too. Let me turn it on for you.
Wow.
Now, the thing about reverb and delay that I want you to understand is that, to me, it's best when you don't know it's there. So whatever I'm doing sound-wise, you don't hear the delays. I hide the delays. And then the reverb, you don't hear it until I play my last note. Let me turn it down just a little bit so I can prove that point. But the idea is that for it to become part of the sound, and then I even try and hide the trails on delays so you don't hear them. Just adds this dimension to it. So you hear a little bit. So basically, it just makes the sound richer, Yeah, so anyway, we all owe Tom a debt for being so generous and sharing all of his discoveries. One of the things I like is I like to be sometimes the last guy to find the cool thing, because all the other guys figure out what the cool thing is. And they do all the work, and then sometimes it takes a few months, sometimes it takes a few years.
Well, that's why I just buy the stuff that you're playing in your videos, Tim.
Talking about. So never worry about waiting for something, because let these guys who are obsessed and great at finding this stuff, let them find the stuff. Now then, it might be hard to find it once it becomes popular, but anyway.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for inviting me over.
Thank you.
I get a chance to hear your gear, talk to you about all these things that it's funny, we talk all the time, but we actually don't talk about gear that much.
No, and my enthusiasm is getting bigger all the time for this stuff, and it's the last thing I expected at this point. So, yeah, here we go.
Cool.
Don't know what's next.
All right, don't forget to subscribe to Tim's channel. It'll be in the description below. Subscribe to my channel as well. Don't just hit the notifications. You don't even need to hit notifications. Just subscribe. Thanks.
See ya.
That's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment. Check out my new Quick Lessons Pro guitar course that just came out. Also, the Beato book, if you want to learn about music theory, that's how you do it. And check out my Beato ear training course at beatoeartraining.com. And don't forget, if you want to support the channel even more, think about becoming a member of the Beato Club. Thanks so much for watching.